In my whole career, I've never seen anything like this.
The Kensington Trust meeting was supposed to end quietly, with closed folders, controlled expressions, and every difficult conversation safely trapped behind palace doors. Instead, before senior staff had even dispersed, one disclosure escaped the room and changed the atmosphere completely. The leak did not concern a minor scheduling dispute or ceremonial disagreement. It centered on Queen Camilla and on a private effort, uncovered during the meeting, that senior figures believed crossed a boundary nobody expected her to test. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William did not react immediately when the provision was read aloud. The prince remained completely still as senior staff explained what had been uncovered inside the fictional Kensington Trust, a privately administered royal body responsible for residences, heritage assets, charitable patronage privileges, and long-term family use arrangements connected to Kensington. The records showed that Camilla had privately sought to extend a future discretionary residence privilege to members of her own family, without first securing formal approval from the trustees. Camilla understood the danger at once. The Queen Consort knew the issue could easily be described as accommodation, but William heard something much larger. To the future king, any privilege attached to Kensington risked becoming connected to the structure of the next reign. His concern was not simply who might use a residence, it was whether the boundaries between Charles's blended family and assets associated with William's future monarchy were being quietly softened before he had agreed to anything. The silence finally broke when a senior administrator produced a dated internal instruction. The note suggested the request had already traveled through several offices before trustees were formally told. That detail changed the mood completely. A discretionary privilege, meaning an arrangement granted by choice rather than automatic legal right, was supposed to depend on proper approval. Yet the paperwork suggested the process had begun moving before that approval existed. William slowly closed the folder. The prince removed his glasses, looked across the table, and asked only one question: who authorized this to move forward? Camilla did not answer immediately. That hesitation mattered. The Queen Consort realized the discussion was no longer about whether the request itself could be defended. It was about process, influence, and whether somebody had assumed the trustees would eventually fall into line. Then the meeting ended, but the crisis did not. One senior staff member privately described the discovery to another palace office. From there, the details moved quickly beyond the room. What had been contained as an internal trust dispute was becoming a wider royal problem. And now one question threatened to overwhelm everything else. Did Charles know? Because once William asked who had authorized the request, the meeting stopped being about property. It became a test of trust inside the king's own family. Behind every palace dispute are people carrying histories far heavier than the documents placed in front of them. William sees boundaries as protection. Camilla sees acceptance as something she has spent decades earning. Charles sees a family he has fought to hold together. And suddenly, one Kensington request places those three instincts directly against one another, forcing each of them to confront a question none can answer comfortably. Where does family loyalty end and institutional responsibility begin? William viewed the dispute through the future monarchy. The prince believed any arrangement connected to residences, access, or privileges surrounding his eventual household had to remain clearly controlled before expectations hardened into precedent. A precedent, in simple terms, is an earlier decision that can later be treated as a model for what should happen again. To William, allowing one unofficial promise to stand could make future limits far harder to defend. Camilla felt the same argument very differently. The Queen Consort heard William's resistance as proof that her family would always remain on the outside of the institution she had spent years supporting beside Charles. She was not demanding automatic status for them, but the rejection still struck something raw. Camilla understood the legal boundary. Emotionally, however, It felt like another reminder that acceptance of her did not necessarily extend to anyone connected to her. Charles became trapped between those two realities. The king knew William represented the monarchy that would follow him, while Camilla remained his wife and closest partner in the present reign. When a private briefing from the Kensington Trust reached him, he read it slowly, until one phrase stopped him cold. The trustees had been bypassed. Charles placed the paper down. That wording mattered, because trustees were the individuals responsible for approving how the fictional body's assets and privileges were administered. If they had been bypassed, the issue was no longer simply whether a request was reasonable. It was whether someone had tried to create momentum before the proper authority could say yes or no. Charles kept reading, and found something worse. His name had been invoked informally during earlier conversations, yet there was no written authorization showing that the king had personally approved the request. The monarch understood immediately how dangerous that gap was. William could see it as hidden influence. Camilla could believe Charles had quietly supported her. Both interpretations could grow if he remained silent. The king turned the briefing face down beside his tea. An aide asked whether Camilla should be told that William had requested a private discussion. Charles did not answer at first, because he already understood what was coming. Kensington was only the stage. The real collision had begun months earlier, during one private exchange that nobody had considered important enough to stop. There are confrontations in royal life that happen through secretaries, carefully drafted letters, and layers of protocol designed to prevent emotion from touching authority. This was not one of them. William asked for Camilla directly. No press office, no trustees between them, no ceremonial smiles. When she entered the room, he already had the Kensington summary beside him. Yet he did not begin with an accusation. He began with one devastating question. Did she believe Charles's personal reassurance entitled anyone to bind his future reign? William made the boundary clear immediately. The prince was not questioning Camilla's place beside Charles, or challenging the role she held during the present reign. The dispute concerned something else entirely: whether commitments connected to the future monarchy could be created without the future sovereign's consent. A future reign means the period in which William would become king and assume responsibility for the royal household, its privileges, and long-term arrangements. To him, that authority could not be inherited by assumption. Camilla answered with emotion rather than procedure. The Queen Consort told William she had spent years watching how quickly people could become disposable when circumstances changed. She did not want members of her own family treated as though their connection to the crown vanished the moment Charles was no longer sovereign. William understood the fear, but he refused the conclusion. Compassion, the prince said, could not quietly become permanent royal entitlement. Camilla pushed back harder. She insisted she had never instructed trustees to approve anything. The Queen Consort believed staff were exploring options, nothing more. She had asked questions. She had expressed preferences. But she had never ordered a future privilege to be guaranteed. William reached for one internal note. The wording changed everything. The proposed arrangement was described as having the Queen's expectation. Camilla stared at the phrase and immediately rejected it. "Those are not my words." The Queen Consort pushed the summary back across the table. William did not touch it. The prince simply asked who inside the palace believed they had permission to turn her preference into something that sounded like an instruction. That question unsettled them both. Camilla had still made the original request. William had not forgotten that. But if she was telling the truth, someone else had strengthened the language while the proposal moved through multiple offices. What began as a conflict between the prince and the Queen Consort suddenly widened into something more dangerous. An internal chain of authority neither fully understood. William looked again at the dated note. Camilla stopped defending herself and started asking questions. Because the crisis now had two separate parts: what she wanted, and who had decided to make that desire sound like a command. Power inside a monarchy rarely belongs entirely to the person wearing the crown. Trust deeds, trustees, constitutional conventions, private ownership structures, and future household authority create boundaries even senior royals cannot erase with a conversation. At Kensington, that distinction suddenly becomes decisive. Whatever Camilla hoped for, and whatever Charles intended emotionally, the trustees reach one conclusion. No permanent future privilege can be promised simply because somebody close to the sovereign expected it. The chair of the fictional Kensington Trust laid out the position with almost uncomfortable calm. Under the trust structure, long-term residence privileges and family use arrangements required trustee approval rather than the personal instruction of one royal family member. A trust deed, the governing document that sets out what trustees may approve and how assets must be managed, placed limits around discretion. William's future authority also remained separate from Charles's present reign, which meant the king could not permanently decide every arrangement that would survive into his son's monarchy. Charles felt the implication immediately. The king had believed reassurance to Camilla could remain personal, something offered by a husband trying to protect his wife from uncertainty. Now he understood that those words may have traveled much further than he intended. A private assurance had been treated as though it carried enough weight to keep the proposal moving. Charles looked down at the briefing and realized that emotional comfort had created administrative momentum. Camilla experienced the finding as humiliation. The queen consort had begun with a concern about her family's future, but that concern was now being examined like an institutional test case. She understood that the trustees were not judging whether she deserved compassion. They were judging whether compassion could become permanent privilege without proper consent. The chair set down a pen. Personal reassurance cannot become permanent authority. William said nothing. Charles looked toward the window. Then the trustees acted. Consideration of the proposed family use privilege was formally suspended, and staff were ordered to trace exactly how the phrase, "the Queen's expectation," had entered the administrative record. That investigation produced the most damaging admission yet. A senior staff member acknowledged that Charles's informal reassurance had been treated as enough political cover to continue progressing the request, even though no written authorization existed. The king understood the failure. Camilla understood the consequence. William had not needed to accuse either of them of conspiracy. The process itself had revealed how easily personal wishes could harden into institutional assumptions when nobody stopped to ask who truly possessed authority. The procedural question was settled. But the personal cost was only beginning. Camilla's office was about to lose direct access to future Kensington planning discussions, and the closing of those doors would make the trustees' abstract boundary feel painfully real. The fallout does not arrive with shouting. It arrives through an altered briefing list, a cancelled attendance note, and one chair that is suddenly no longer required at the next Kensington planning session. That is how royal power often changes quietly, administratively, almost politely. For Camilla, however, the message could not be mistaken. Whatever influence she possessed through Charles's present reign would no longer be allowed to shape arrangements belonging to William's future household. Camilla received the revised schedule in private. The queen consort scanned the page once, then again, until she reached the missing Kensington meeting. Future trust planning, the long-term decisions concerning residences, privileges, and arrangements expected to carry into William's eventual reign, had now been formally separated from matters belonging to Charles as current sovereign. Camilla still retained her full status beside the king. Her existing duties remained untouched, but this particular door had closed. Camilla folded the page once and set it down. Her tea remained untouched. Charles noticed immediately. The king understood the restriction in legal and administrative terms, yet emotionally, it felt like something far harsher. His wife was being removed from discussions she had once expected to influence, and every protective instinct in him urged intervention. William refused to soften the boundary. The prince was told that allowing Camilla to attend occasionally might reduce embarrassment without changing much in practice. He rejected the suggestion. If the trustees had ruled that future arrangements required separate authority, pretending otherwise for appearances would make the ruling meaningless. William did not demand humiliation, but he would not preserve blurred authority simply to make everyone feel more comfortable. Charles struggled with that distinction. The king wanted to argue that one additional chair at a planning meeting could hardly threaten the future monarchy. Camilla stopped him before he could turn that feeling into action. "Do not fight them for me." The queen consort said it quietly. She told Charles another royal rescue would only deepen the humiliation because it would make the restriction look like something she could not accept without his protection. Camilla had spent too many years fighting for legitimacy to now appear dependent on the king overriding boundaries on her behalf. Charles looked at her differently after that. The monarch remained wounded, but Camilla had removed the easiest response available to him. William had drawn the line. The trustees had enforced it. Camilla had chosen not to resist it. That left Charles with only one place for his anger to go. Not toward the administrators, not toward his wife, toward the son whose future he could influence, advise, and protect, but could no longer command. And behind the next closed door, father and son would finally have to say what this dispute was really about. When Charles and William finally meet alone, the documents are gone. So are the secretaries, trustees, and carefully rehearsed institutional phrases. For the first time since the Kensington discovery, they are simply father and son discussing the fear beneath the argument. Charles admits that he wanted Camilla to know she would not vanish from royal memory when his reign ended. William admits something equally uncomfortable. His resistance was never intended as punishment. It was fear of inheriting promises he had never made. Charles speaks first, because the misunderstanding began with him. The king explains that his original assurance that Camilla's family would be looked after was emotional, not administrative. He had meant continued affection, respect, and personal connection. He had not meant a guaranteed royal residence or permanent institutional privilege. Institutional advantage, in this context, means an official benefit tied to royal structures rather than ordinary family kindness. William hears the distinction, but the prince also explains why the wording became dangerous once staff began treating reassurance like policy. William tells his father that personal relationships can continue without binding the next reign. The future king has no intention of cutting Camilla or her relatives out of family life simply because Charles is no longer sovereign. But private affection and permanent royal privilege cannot be treated as the same thing. One belongs to family, the other belongs to authority. Charles asks the question he has been carrying since the leak began. Would you still have stopped it if nobody knew? William pauses. Yes. The prince says the boundary would have been identical even if the entire matter had remained hidden. What he regrets is not stopping the proposal. He regrets that Camilla learned the limit through public humiliation rather than through a quieter family conversation. Charles absorbs that slowly. The king then admits something harder. Years of protecting Camilla have trained staff to anticipate his wishes before he formally expresses them. Loyalty has sometimes become assumption. The monarch can now see how people around him may have strengthened vague reassurance into something that sounded like instruction. William accepts that point. The prince also makes clear that Camilla should not carry sole blame for language she never authorized. She made the request. That part cannot be erased. But somebody else turned expectation into administrative momentum. For the first time, father and son agree completely on what happens next. The proposed future privilege ends. Camilla is not publicly scapegoated. The staff process that allowed private wishes to harden into implied commands is dismantled. Charles nods once. Nothing between them is magically repaired. But the king and the future king finally possess one shared version of the truth. And after days of leaks, humiliation, and divided loyalties, that fragile agreement gives the palace something it desperately needs: a single answer for what comes next. By the following morning, what began around a polished Kensington table is no longer a private royal argument. It belongs to headlines, broadcasters, palace watchers, and crowds staring through gates at buildings whose internal rules suddenly feel intensely personal. Yet the story the public receives is different from the one that first leaked. Instead of a simple tale about Camilla reaching for influence, a more complicated picture emerges, one involving family reassurance, overconfident staff, William's boundaries, and Charles's impossible loyalties. Palace communications moved quickly to narrow the facts. The official statement confirmed that the proposed Kensington privilege had been withdrawn and that no future entitlement had been created. An entitlement, in this context, means a benefit treated as guaranteed rather than something requiring fresh approval. Just as importantly, the palace refused to accuse Camilla of deliberately bypassing the trustees. That restraint reflected the private agreement between Charles and William. The boundary would stand, but the queen consort would not be publicly turned into the sole villain. Camilla still felt exposed. The queen consort watched broadcasters repeat her name even after officials acknowledged that the most damaging wording had not been hers. She lowered the television volume as a newspaper front page filled the screen. Charles remained beside her without speaking. The king knew the statement had protected her from the harshest accusation, but he also knew public stories rarely become gentle simply because official language is careful. William felt the cost from the opposite side. The prince had wanted to prevent an unofficial promise from binding his future household. He had not wanted the decision interpreted as a rejection of Camilla or her family. Yet much of the coverage reduced a complex institutional line to a personal feud. William understood that drawing boundaries in public meant losing control over how those boundaries were emotionally understood. Then one headline seized the morning: Kensington line drawn. A fictional newspaper placed William and Camilla side by side, using separate images from unrelated royal engagements to create the impression of two competing courts. Outside Kensington Palace, a small crowd gathered while broadcasters repeatedly described the dispute as the first visible demonstration of how the future king intended to separate his household from his father's. Charles heard that framing and disliked it immediately. Camilla did too. William understood why it was powerful. The story had moved beyond one failed request. It had become a symbol of succession. But symbols can either harden into resentment or be given a different meaning. The public now had its headline. Only Charles, Camilla, and William could decide whether Kensington line drawn would mean permanent fracture or a boundary everyone could finally accept and live with. In the end, the Kensington Trust crisis is not resolved by somebody winning and somebody losing. It ends when the royal family finally separates two ideas it had allowed to blur together for too long: belonging to a family and possessing a permanent claim on the institutions surrounding that family. Camilla remains Charles's wife, William remains his heir, and neither relationship is erased. But the proposed privilege disappears completely. More importantly, everyone involved finally understands why it had to. The fictional trust closes the matter formally. No future Kensington residence privilege will be reserved for members of Camilla's family, and the proposal is removed from active consideration. Staff procedures are tightened as well. From now on, informal royal conversations cannot be treated as institutional instructions without written authorization. Written authorization simply means a clear, recorded approval from the person who actually holds the power to make the decision. The safeguard is procedural, but its purpose is deeply human. Nobody should again mistake affection for authority. Camilla accepts the outcome without asking Charles to reverse it. The queen consort is bruised by the episode, and she does not pretend otherwise. Her name carried the scandal. Her intentions were questioned. But she also understands that another intervention from the king would only revive the very confusion everyone has worked to end. Charles remains beside her, but this time the monarch does not try to rescue her from a boundary she has chosen to accept. William also leaves the crisis changed. The prince still believes he was right to stop the proposal. Yet he now understands that protecting the future monarchy cannot mean treating family emotion as irrelevant. Boundaries without compassion become punishment. Compassion without boundaries becomes entitlement. The future king needs both. Charles finally says the part that should have been clear from the beginning. His affection for Camilla's relatives is personal and unconditional. They do not stop mattering to him because one reign eventually ends. But the king accepts that his feelings cannot bind William's future household. The monarch can offer love. He cannot promise institutional privilege on behalf of his successor. Responsibility settles across all of them. Camilla wanted reassurance. Charles spoke too broadly. Staff turned sentiment into momentum. William stopped that momentum before it hardened into expectation. That is the final meaning of Kensington. Camilla was never expelled from the family. A presumed privilege was prevented from becoming permanent. In their final private exchange, William tells her that personal invitations will always remain personal, but future royal privileges must belong to the future reign. Camilla holds his gaze. I understand. No argument follows. The monarchy survives not by denying family loyalty, but by refusing to confuse loyalty with entitlement. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.